Charlene had been on death row for nearly 2 decades. She spent all those years in silence, refusing visitors and ignoring offers of help. She never asked for comfort, letters, or forgiveness, which is why everyone was shocked when she made one strange request. Upon hearing what she wanted, the guards quietly laughed in the prison halls. It wasn't a special meal, nor seeing an old friend, not even a simple goodbye. She simply wanted to see her elderly mother, and a dog whose significance nobody seemed to understand. When the warden got this request, he hesitated for weeks, unable to understand why. After all these years, she needed to see that animal. In the end, he granted it, unaware of the consequences this simple act would bring. Outside the prison, Charlene's mother, Miss Loretta, waited patiently for permission. She never questioned her daughter's request. She simply prayed it would be granted. Beside her stood Juno, an old, weary dog whose eyes seemed to hold ancient secrets. When approval finally came, Loretta felt a shiver run down her spine without knowing exactly why. Guards watched curiously as this quiet dog entered, seemingly ordinary, yet with something unusual in his attentive gaze. The dog walked calmly down the prison's dim corridor, neither barking nor showing any nervousness. Nobody there imagined that once he stepped into that cell, this animal would reveal something capable of shocking everyone around him. Charlene waited seated on her narrow cement bed, her eyes fixed firmly on the corridor, her face marked by years without a single smile. When she saw her mother slowly enter the room, Charlene smiled softly for the first time in years, but her expression quickly changed as her eyes desperately searched for something else behind her mother. The instant she saw the dog, Charlene jumped up abruptly, eyes filling with tears as her whole body began to tremble. This wasn't simply nostalgia she felt at that moment. It was something deeper, urgent, mysterious. What connection could exist between a condemned woman and an old dog to cause such an intense reaction? Juno moved slowly toward Charlene, sniffing the air carefully, as if searching for something very specific. The entire room fell into complete silence, staring at the scene with uncertainty. Then, without any warning, Juno stopped, raised his ears, and released a deep growl, staring directly toward the dark corridor. Charlene held her breath, watching each of the dog's movements as if her entire life depended on it. Nobody understood this unexpected reaction, but Charlene clearly knew exactly what it meant. Something in her past was directly connected to this dog's presence, and at that moment, everything began making sense. What kind of secret could an animal possibly reveal at such a delicate moment? The guards started shifting nervously, sensing the unexpected tension rising inside the room. Loretta tightly gripped the red notebook she always carried, without uttering a single word. Charlene's expression was now alert, as though she finally understood what needed to be done. But before she could act, the dog lunged forward into the corridor, sniffing intensely as though about to uncover something hidden within those walls. Guards tried to restrain him, but Charlene shouted at them to stop immediately. The atmosphere became electrified. Nobody could understand the reason for this sudden chaos caused simply by the dog's presence. What could be hidden inside this prison that only Juno could find? In that instant, it became clear the dog's visit wasn't just a simple goodbye. Charlene didn't want mere closure before her departure. There was something much bigger at stake, something needing revelation precisely at that moment. Her mother, the guards, and even the warden were now caught in a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Why did Charlene demand to see a seemingly ordinary dog as her final wish? Why had he reacted so strangely upon entering that cold cell? What could the senses of that old dog detect inside the prison, something nobody else could see? This wasn't just another visitation, it was the beginning of a revelation that would alter everything they thought they knew about that place.
Before diving into this exciting story, we want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our incredible content. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. By subscribing, you'll become a valued member of our growing community, where we share amazing stories, insightful lessons, and much more. Don't wait any longer. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this amazing journey.
The iron gate echoes like a muffled thunder every morning. Charlene Monroe wakes up before the sun, sitting at the edge of her concrete bed, holding a letter she never dared to send. She's rewritten the same paragraph so many times. The paper now carries the imprint of her fingers, her sweat, her waiting. "I didn't kill that boy." She says it softly, almost like a whisper for survival. No tears fall anymore. They dried up years ago along with the visits, the hugs, and the dignity. They stripped without mercy. In death row, time walks slow, but pain runs sharp like a loose blade. On the other side of the wall, Miss Loretta leans against the cold prison stone every single day, never failing, as if the concrete could hear her. She doesn't speak loudly. She just presses her forehead to the rough surface, holding a worn, leather collar with trembling hands, and prays from her soul. Beside her, Juno, the dog who grew up with the murdered child, stares into the distance like he still knows his owner hasn't completely died. The prison warden watches from a second-floor window. He always looks away when he sees Miss Loretta. She unsettles him, not because she screams, but because she endures in silence. That morning, young lawyer Jacob Elias approaches him with a request. 1 hour, just 1 hour with the dog. She just wants to see her mother. The dog belonged to the child. The warden lifts his eyes with disdain, sighs, and with a crooked smile says coldly, "That woman's done enough lying, and dogs don't talk." Inside the cell, Charlene expects nothing anymore. She only prays they won't take her faith away. Sometimes the guards laugh, sometimes they just ignore her. But one of them, an older man, hands her a clean handkerchief without a word, a gesture she cherishes like a sacrament. On the wall, a cross drawn in charcoal marks her only remaining hope. Not to live, but to die in peace, knowing someone out there still believes. In the women's dormitory, some younger inmates whisper about Charlene. Some think she's a saint. Others think she's insane, but none dare to ask. They watch her kneel with her eyes closed, speaking to someone no one sees. Only Juno would understand. She still dreams of him. His scent, the way he'd run to the door when she came home. He never growled at me, she thinks. Not once. In the admin wing, Jacob Elias fights the clock. He cuts pieces of the case file, scribbles notes by hand, and prepares an emergency visitation request using long-forgotten precedents. With every word he writes, he feels Loretta's presence like a constant flame. She prays differently, he thinks. Not asking for revenge, she prays like she's already seen freedom. That's what fuels him, not just the case. Her faith. That's what pulls him forward. Miss Loretta returns home by bus, Juno's collar still wrapped around her wrist. On the ride, she closes her eyes and recites scripture silently. She remembers when Charlene taught at the community center, when kids would come for bread and homework at the same time. Her hands were never made for killing, she says aloud to the driver without realizing it. He nods, respectfully. The whole town's heard that story, but only she insists on listening to the end. Meanwhile, inside the prison system, a new access request flashes on a supervisor's screen. It's a strange one, submitted by a new lawyer on behalf of a forgotten inmate. Before he can approve or deny it, a red notification blinks. Request denied by warden. And once again, Charlene falls asleep with the letter she never sent, and the kind of hope only the innocent still hold. Miss Loretta walked through the neighborhood like someone speaking to ghosts. Every alley carried the echo of a memory. Charlene sitting on a curb with children in her lap, helping neighbors with their paperwork, handing out snacks at the Blue Door community center. Everything there spoke of her daughter. But now it all felt like another life. Loretta didn't cry in public. But at home, she placed her Bible on the table, lit a candle, and opened her red notebook. It was more than a diary. It was an altar of resistance. In it, she wrote everything she discovered. And at the end of each page, she repeated, "The Lord still speaks. I just need to listen better." She had never trusted the story told in court. From day one, something didn't sit right. The mother's testimony felt rehearsed. The evidence was flimsy, yet treated like gospel. Charlene had said she heard a scream and ran, and when she found the boy lifeless, she tried to help. But the police report read like it was written before the scene was ever seen. The prosecutor sounded like he was reading a play. And no one truly listened to Charlene. Loretta knew her daughter stood alone in that courtroom, and that the system was in a hurry to sentence. That's when she decided to act. She gathered old clippings, trial notes, and began visiting people. She spoke with neighbors of the Weston family, with Charlene's former co-workers, with anyone living near the mansion. Some welcomed her. Others turned away. Many pretended not to remember. But Loretta wrote down everything. Dates, names, broken phrases. An older woman said something Loretta had never heard before. There was another woman. She worked there too. Quiet type. Heard everything. Then she vanished. The words echoed inside her. Loretta wrote them down and underlined them 3 times. Someone disappeared. Determined, she turned to a local legal aid center. She had no money, but she brought her notebook like a case file. Jacob Elias, a young lawyer fresh out of school, received her with polite curiosity. He thought she wanted comfort, but once he began reading, he realized this was deeper than sympathy. "You wrote all this yourself?" he asked. She answered, "I'm not alone." Jacob went quiet. He read more, saw that listed witnesses were never called, street cameras were ignored. It was as if the case had been sealed out of convenience. He flipped through a stack of papers. A receipt fell out between old newsprint. A woman's name was printed on it, one that appeared nowhere in the files. The purchase was dated the same day as the murder. Paid in cash. The name sounded fake, but that wasn't what shook Jacob. It was the handwriting. Elegant, tight, with exaggerated curls. He stared at it. "This doesn't belong here," he muttered. Loretta picked up the paper gently. Something about that script made her uneasy. She didn't know why. But in her notebook she wrote, "The handwriting smiles, but has no soul." That night, she couldn't sleep. Dreamed of Charlene as a little girl, teaching the dog to sit, saying, "He understands everything, Mama. He just can't talk." Loretta woke up holding Juno's leash. She walked to the living room wall and prayed softly. She didn't ask for justice, she asked for direction. In the notebook, she penned something new. "The enemy is silent, but leaves traces." For the first time, she felt close. She didn't know to what, but something was near. At the prison, a quiet employee crossed the yard with cautious steps. She avoided conversations, kept to shadows, but always seemed to be listening. When Charlene's name came up in casual talk among guards, she froze, stood completely still, then continued walking like nothing had happened. But her hands were trembling, and her silence felt heavier than steel. It was as if the truth was standing right there in the hallway and unseen but breathing. The judge kept glancing at the clock. The emergency hearing had been granted, but only as a formality, like signing a paper you don't believe will change anything. Jacob Elias shuffled his notes while Miss Loretta sat clutching her red notebook, in her lap, hands clasped over her chest. The courtroom was cold, flooded with sunlight and stripped of hope. "We're here to request humanitarian access," Jacob began. His voice didn't shake, but his eyes revealed the weight of the moment. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Access to what, exactly?" And then came the thunderclap of a sentence. "To the victim's dog. The one who grew up with the accused." Silence fell. One of the clerks stifled a laugh, but the judge raised his hand for quiet. Jacob continued. He explained that the dog, Juno, had been in the house the day of the crime, slept in the child's room, never stopped recognizing Charlene, reacted to scents, voices, presences. "We know it's not technical evidence, but it's emotional memory. a living thread that never lied. The judge listened silently. Miss Loretta stared at the floor like she was praying without words. Outside, the sky darkened. A low rumble of thunder split the afternoon, a sign from God, or a warning. Jacob presented his exhibits: photos of the child with Juno, vet reports, a handwritten letter from a neighbor saying the dog barked at strangers, except Charlene. The dog didn't forget. Maybe he's the only one who still knows what really happened. The judge asked for silence and slowly flipped through the pages. After a long pause, he spoke. Granted, but with conditions. 1 hour. No cameras. No press. Miss Loretta choked back a sob. Jacob nodded. For a moment, the impossible had opened its door, but no one noticed the faint creak from the back hallway. Behind the partition wall, someone had been listening. No name. No face. Just wide eyes, shallow breaths, sweating palms. When they heard the name Juno, they dropped the plastic cup in their hand. Water splashed across the floor, but they didn't move. Frozen, head bowed, as if that name had stabbed through a memory long buried. The receptionist approached. "You okay?" The reply came in a whisper, barely audible. "The dog?" "No." Inside Charlene's cell, a guard handed her a handwritten note. She read it with trembling fingers. At the end, she whispered, "He's coming?" The guard said nothing, but in his eyes, something had changed. Not contempt, not pity, just respect. For the first time in years, Charlene felt her heart skip a beat. She remembered Juno as a puppy, licking her hand, wearing that red ribbon collar. "Will he remember me?" she thought. A single tear fell onto the paper. At home, Miss Loretta packed a cloth bag with Juno's things: the old leash, his favorite toy, a cloth that still carried the scent of their former life. She didn't tell anyone, but she knelt beside the dog and prayed aloud. "Lord, if you gave animals memory, let him remember. Let him show." Juno laid his head on her leg and sighed. Her faith didn't ask for miracles, just truth, even if it came through a bark. Inside the prison, whispers began to spread. No one knew the details, but rumors burned fast. "They're letting a dog in," inmates murmured. Guards speculated. One woman, always invisible, turned pale. Her hand froze mid-fold on a sheet. The laundry room radio repeated the news. Juno. Just that. And in that moment, she knew her time had begun to run out. The iron gate creaked deeply, as if the prison itself sensed what was coming. Miss Loretta walked in with steady steps, her simple dress swaying gently. In one hand, she held Juno's old leash. In the other, a cloth that still carried her daughter's childhood scent. Beside her, the dog walked in silence, alert, calm, but with eyes that knew this place held more than walls. The guards escorted them to the inner yard, where the concrete felt colder than usual. No audience, just emptiness, and a cell at the far end. Loretta took a deep breath. "Easy now, my boy," she whispered to Juno. And then the bars opened. Charlene stood inside. She didn't look like the woman who had entered years ago. Her face was thinner, her gaze deeper, but her posture was still hers. When she saw her mother, she couldn't hold back the tears. She dropped the handkerchief she held, took 2 steps forward, then stopped. Their eyes met first, then their arms. The embrace was long, urgent, painful. Miss Loretta held her daughter like she was grasping life itself. No words were spoken, only muffled sobs against a shoulder. And Juno, watching, waiting, as if he knew his time was near. When Charlene knelt, Juno ran to her. He sniffed her hands, licked her fingers, rested his head in her lap. She smiled, through tears. "He remembers, Mama. He remembers." Miss Loretta didn't reply. She just smiled back, eyes full. But something shifted. Juno raised his head, sniffed the air, and stiffened. His posture changed, muscles tense. He turned toward the side corridor, sniffed again, then a growl, low, controlled, but full of memory. The nearest guard stepped forward, but Loretta raised a hand. Wait. Juno took 2 steps forward, eyes fixed, tail still. He sniffed the floor, then the air. A chill ran down Charlene's spine. She had never seen him like that. The dog looked possessed. Then, a bark, sharp, loud, toward the back corridor. Everyone turned, no one there, or so it seemed. From deep inside the block, hurried footsteps echoed. A staff member appeared with a clipboard and a radio on her belt. She tried to look calm, but her eyes were glassy. When she saw Juno barking, she froze. The dog pulled at the leash, growled louder, lunged. Guards held him back, but he kept straining. Miss Loretta said aloud, "He remembers the smell." The woman turned pale, stopped mid-step, and for a moment, she trembled. Her radio hit the floor with a loud clatter. The silence that followed was louder than the bark. Charlene stood frozen. Juno growled, every fiber of him screaming something only he could remember. The woman stepped back. Then again. "Restrain the animal," one officer shouted. But Loretta didn't move. She looked at her daughter, then at Juno. "Is it her?" she whispered. Charlene didn't answer. She didn't have to. The dog already had. In the chaos that followed, shouts mixed with commands. But Juno didn't bite. He wasn't attacking in anger. He was remembering, pointing, revealing, as if time hadn't erased the scent of that night. The woman backed into the wall, panting, sweating, and for the first time, her eyes couldn't lie. Miss Loretta knelt, held the leash, and said with a trembling voice, "Truth has a scent, and he remembers." The prison warden arrived, demanding answers, but it was too late. The dog had led the way, and the woman's reaction spoke louder than any statement. No handcuffs, no accusations, not yet. But for the first time in years, Charlene felt something new in the air. A silence not born from pain, but from truth. The visit didn't end as expected, but what began there couldn't be undone. The cell was locked quickly. Guards tried to calm the scene, but the tension clung to the air like smoke in a sealed room. Juno, still restless, kept his eyes fixed on the hallway where the woman had disappeared. Miss Loretta held the leash tightly, her eyes watery, not with fear, but certainty. Charlene stood motionless, hand on her chest, trying to understand what the dog had sensed. None of it made sense. Yet everything felt connected. The bark, the scent, the tremble. It was as if time had cracked open, and through that fracture, truth had started to leak. Jacob Elias arrived minutes later, summoned urgently by Loretta. He went straight to the records room and demanded the employee registry from the last 5 years. The administrators hesitated, but he had legal grounds. With the recent incident, an internal review was justified. He scanned each name slowly. Nothing stood out, until one detail emerged. A surname, an address, a date. Everything aligned, except the name. Loretta arrived, carrying her red notebook. She opened to the page with the laundry receipt she'd found weeks before. Margaret Hale, it read, but the address matched that of a current prison staffer listed as Marianne Bishop. Jacob narrowed his eyes. He grabbed a magnifying glass. The official handwriting and the receipt differed, slightly, but the note scribbled on the back, "Urgent pickup," was unmistakable. Same loops, same slant, same hand. Loretta whispered. She changed her name, but not her handwriting. The next day, Jacob gained access to staff entry footage from previous years. And there it was. The realization. One of the women captured in older footage was the same who'd reacted to Juno. Different hair color, new name, new uniform, but the same eyes. The admission record showed a recommendation letter signed by a retired police officer. Loretta recognized the name instantly. It was the lead investigator in the child's murder case. Same letter, same story, buried for years. When Charlene heard the news, she couldn't speak. She sat in the corner of her cell, arms wrapped around her knees, shaking, not with fear, with release. For the first time, something outside herself spoke for her. This wasn't her word against theirs. Now there was paper, a link, a lie, exposed. She was here the whole time watching me die, she said. Loretta knelt outside the cell, hand on the cold wall. And still, God kept you. Every day. Inside the administration office, the prison tried to bury the findings. But the cross-referenced records had already reached the judge overseeing Charlene's appeal. Jacob included the receipt, the staff entry data, and the suspicious letter. "This is proof of a cover-up," he wrote. The DA's office received it by dawn. The tone of their replies shifted. No more arrogance, just caution. For the first time, they were listening. Across town, Miss Loretta returned to where it all began. She walked past the old Weston mansion, now occupied by a new family. She placed her hand on the gate and closed her eyes. Juno stood beside her, sniffing the air. Silence. The peace of that place didn't match her memories. But there was something different in the air, a soft breeze, the smell of rain on soil, and a quiet conviction in her chest. "Lies run fast," she said, "but truth has a longer memory." On the way home, she wrote a new entry. She didn't vanish. She hid in the safest place, where no one would look, among the condemned. The weight of the revelation didn't break her. It strengthened her. Each lie exposed let in more light. And that night, closing her notebook, Loretta looked out the window toward the stars. "Now it's in your hands," she whispered. But deep inside, she knew. Justice was already unfolding. The interrogation room door closed with a dull thud. Inside, Edna sat motionless, eyes fixed on the wall as if the world beyond no longer existed. The guards didn't speak her name, only called her the employee. But now everyone knew. The silence she carried was the same as years ago. But something in her had shifted. She didn't resist, didn't ask why she was there. She just smiled. A crooked, unsettling smile. As if she knew this day would come. As if she had waited for it. The mask was gone, and the monster at last had a face. Jacob leaned over the table, his voice measured. "You've been identified through cross-checked documents. We have the entry logs, the false recommendation, the records." Edna didn't flinch, just stared, eyes distant. But when she heard the name Charlene Monroe, she blinked twice, then let out a low laugh like a memory she enjoyed. "She was the favorite," she whispered, "always smiling, always perfect." The room froze. For the first time, she referenced the woman she had framed, but it still sounded like she was talking about herself. Miss Loretta watched from the monitor room, her hands trembling over her red notebook. She didn't want hate. She wanted truth. She wanted to understand how someone could hide such darkness for so long. On the screen, Edna rocked slightly in her chair as if swaying to a grief only she could hear. Then, without warning, she screamed, "No one saw me, not even when I cleaned up their blood." The words sliced through the air. Jacob didn't move. He pressed the recorder on the table. The red light flicked on. She kept talking. Disjointed words, fragmented memories, a confession buried in madness. She spoke of the child like a fragile toy, spoke of the mother as weak. But when she mentioned Charlene, Her eyes narrowed. She moved through the house like light, like she belonged, like I was the floor beneath her. She slammed her hand on the table, startled by her own rage. She never knew what it was, like to be invisible. The guards exchanged glances. What had once been suspicion now had a name, a voice, and a motive. Jacob didn't interrupt. Every word was a puzzle piece, every gesture a living truth. Edna mentioned names, described scenes, gave details that couldn't be invented. She recounted the night of the crime, like a play rehearsed too many times. He wouldn't stop crying. She held him. I just wanted quiet. And then, silence. Her body stiffened, head tilted slightly. It was like she vanished inside herself again. But the recording was complete. In Charlene's cell, a guard's radio whispered updates from the next room. She leaned back against the wall, eyes on the ceiling, unsure if she was praying or simply breathing. Miss Loretta entered quietly, knelt beside her daughter, and took her hand. No words, just a touch, and in that, release. The weight of years branded as a killer began to fall away, slowly. She confessed? Charlene asked. Her mother nodded, and a single tear fell between their intertwined fingers. In the legal wing, Jacob saved the audio in 3 separate files. The recording would go to the prosecutor, the judge, and internal affairs. Denial was no longer possible. The truth now had shape and voice. He looked at the computer screen, exhaled slowly, and typed into the report, unsolicited confession, recorded by internal device. At the bottom, almost involuntarily, he added, the mother was right, from the beginning. And right there, justice started writing its reply. The report reached the federal judge's desk early in the morning, 47 pages, stamped urgent. At the top, a seal. Extraordinary sentence review. The judge, a stern man with a trimmed beard and tired eyes, read in silence. With each page turned, his jaw tightened. When he reached the confession transcript, he closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and whispered, "How many truths have we buried for convenience?" Outside his door, the phone was already ringing. The press had caught the scent. The Monroe case was reopening, and it wasn't just about Charlene anymore. It was about everything silence had allowed to rot. Inside the prison system, files began disappearing. Paper records swapped places. Entry logs were tampered with by hand. But it was too late. Jacob had scanned everything, filed backup copies with external agencies. Among the documents, one detail stood out: Edna's recommendation letter. The signer, Sergeant Carl Denvers, retired, the very man who led the boys' murder investigation. When confronted, he claimed it was just a favor for an old friend. But financial records showed regular payments from a shell company tied to the Weston family. Jacob didn't need more, but what came next was worse. Internal police reports showed Edna had once been named in a domestic complaint, filed by a former employer accusing her of aggression and theft. The case was closed without follow-up. The officer who dismissed it? Carl Denvers. The pieces fit. A network. Small, silent, but efficient. One that silenced threats and protected those who knew how to stay quiet. She was shielded because the system preferred a black woman to pay for everything, Jacob said, recording a video statement. Now the truth had to be known. Miss Loretta was called to testify informally in court. She didn't hesitate. She brought the red notebook, copies of notes, handwritten scraps, nights without sleep, and faith held tight. The judge never interrupted. When she finished, she placed the notebook on the table and said, "They thought I was just a grieving old mother, but I was the living memory of what the world tried to erase." Juno stood by her side the entire time, silent, steady, like a statue carved of flesh and truth. In Charlene's cell, time slowed. But the silence was different now. Not the silence of death, the silence of hope. Each footstep down the hallway sounded different. The guard's stares had changed. No one called her names anymore. Some couldn't even meet her eyes. She didn't want revenge, just her name back. "They don't have to say sorry," she told her mother. "They just need to take this weight off my name, that's all." The staff member involved, Edna, was transferred to a psychiatric unit inside the prison. Diagnosis: psychotic disorder with persecutory delusions. But Jacob knew. Everyone did. She wasn't just ill. She was bitter. Forged by rejection, protected by others' convenience. She wore madness like a cloak. But behind it was calculation, envy, and a twisted hunger to destroy what shone too brightly. She didn't want justice. She wanted to watch pain up close, Jacob wrote in his final statement. The judge's decision was sent quietly. Immediate reevaluation of Charlene, Monroe's conviction and provisional suspension of her death sentence. The case would go to full review. The DA's office said nothing. No press conference. Just a heavy silence that said everything. It was as if the walls of justice were cracking, one brick at a time. And on every brick was the name of someone who stayed silent or silenced others. But now, the sound in those halls was different. It was the sound of something coming back to life. The folded paper was handed over quietly, as if the news itself didn't know how to begin. The oldest guard in the unit walked toward Charlene's cell, holding the official document, the signed order from the federal judge suspending her, death sentence and granting a full case review. When she read the words, she didn't cry. Instead, she closed her eyes and rested her forehead against the bars, as if that single gesture could contain years of pain. Her shoulders trembled slightly. The silence around her was so thick it seemed to be praying with her. No cameras, no announcements, just a woman, and the sense that someone, somewhere, had finally listened. Miss Loretta was leaning against the same wall where she had prayed every morning. The sun was just rising when a guard rushed to her and whispered, "It's today." Juno stood up immediately. His eyes gleamed with something close to divine instinct. He began pulling at the leash before Loretta even took a step. As they passed through the prison gates, Juno led the way like he had always known where to go. Behind him, Loretta walked slowly, clutching her Bible and the same ribbon she had worn on her hair since the first visit. The air was heavy, but something new lingered in it, the weight of hope. Charlene waited in the prison yard, standing tall. There was something different in her, a glow in her eyes that defied exhaustion, injustice, and silence. When she saw her mother and Juno approaching, she smiled first with her eyes, then her lips. Juno ran toward her, barked once, and laid down at her feet like he had as a puppy. The embrace between mother and daughter was long, wordless, and unhurried. It was not a reunion. It was a return from exile. Freedom wasn't final yet, but the wall between them had finally fallen. Jacob Elias arrived with a folder in hand and tears threatening to spill. He approached quietly, as if honoring a sacred moment. When Charlene saw him, she reached out and said, "Thank you for listening to my mother when no one else would." He replied, voice cracked, "She's the reason I listened. I just followed her steps." Guards formed a path toward the main gate. No cuffs, no shouting, just the sound of wind brushing metal bars. Reporters waited outside, but no one inside was in a rush to step out. The outside world had frozen. As Charlene walked through the prison gates, chants of justice and freedom rose like waves against concrete. But she didn't look at the cameras, only at her mother. Juno stayed close, proud, as if guarding something sacred. Miss Loretta raised her hand and said, calmly but firmly, "Today is not for interviews. Today is for breathing." They stepped aside, away from the crowd, and found shade under a tree in the parking lot. They sat on the grass. They shared pieces of bread. And in that quiet, no microphone could capture what passed between them. Later, Jacob gave a short press briefing. He outlined the next steps: judicial review, potential exoneration, and an investigation into the web that had shielded Edna. But before he ended, he pointed to Miss Loretta, still sitting far off with Juno in her lap. "This woman is the reason we're here. She heard what no one else would. She wrote justice by hand, one in a red notebook." The cameras turned toward her. Loretta just smiled, nodding gently, as if returning all credit to the heavens above. That night, back home, Loretta placed the open Bible on the bed and laid the red notebook beside it. Charlene knelt next to her, just like she had as a child. They prayed in silence, slowly, with no rehearsed words, just gratitude and quiet. The window was open, letting the breeze in, and the sound of trees mingled with the sound of forgiveness. Juno curled up at the foot of the bed, eyes closed, as if he too understood the chapter had ended. It wasn't just a good day. It was peace. Real peace. The kind that comes only when truth finally arrives. Before falling asleep, Charlene turned to her mother and said, "You taught me that faith isn't about closing your eyes. It's about keeping your heart open when everything hurts." Loretta smiled gently, brushed a hand through her daughter's hair, and replied, "Faith is the last thing they try to take. That's why it's the first thing that saves." That night, there were no more dreams of cages, no more nightmares about the end, only the soft sound of two women breathing freely, and a dog who never forgot. Miss Loretta returned to the prison wall the next morning, for the first time without the weight of sorrow on her shoulders. She no longer carried the leash, nor eyes desperate for answers. But something inside her couldn't resist the need to come back. Not to plead, but to honor. She carried white flowers, satin ribbons, and her red notebook now tied shut with a strip of hand-stitched cloth. She stopped at the same spot where she had prayed for years, pressed her forehead to the cold concrete, and whispered, "Thank you." Juno stood beside her, touching his nose to the wall, still, as if that place, once a prison, was now a sanctuary. She tied the ribbons gently along the fence that lined the yard. Each ribbon bore the name of someone forgotten, someone whose voice had been silenced: children, mothers, wrongfully accused men. At first, people stared and laughed. Some found it odd. But soon, neighbors, former classmates of Charlene, and even former inmates came to visit that wall. They brought flowers, handwritten prayers, small notes with words of hope. And where there had only been wire and stone, a memorial was born. A quiet shrine of faith that would not quit. Charlene kept to herself, but one morning, she accepted an invitation to return. A small tribute would be held outside the prison gates. She didn't speak. She simply came. Wearing simple clothes, her hair tied back as before, but with a different light in her eyes. The crowd stood in stillness as she approached the wall with her mother. She picked up one ribbon, closed her eyes, and tied it to the fence with care. "This one's for those still unheard," she said. And the crowd moved, stood in one full minute of silence. The story had crossed walls and cities. Churches began referencing the Loretta case in sermons. Schools discussed emotional memory and justice. Universities examined the trial as a case study in restorative law. But Loretta never sought recognition. She still woke up early, walked the same streets, smiled at the bakery counter. When people thanked her, she simply said, "It's all grace." And when they asked what had happened, she replied, "It was God and a stubborn dog." Jacob. Elias returned to the prison to hand-deliver a letter signed by the new federal judge. Charlene, now freed under review, read it with wet eyes. "This doesn't erase everything," she said, "but it tells me there's a path." Jacob nodded. "You were stronger than I could have been," he said, then handed her a bound copy of the full case file, with a single sentence on the cover, "For Charlene Monroe, who was seen." Behind Loretta's house, she began creating a small open space with wooden benches, a plain cross, and the verse she had written over and over in her red notebook. "The truth shall set you free." Children from the neighborhood often passed by and stopped to pet Juno. One girl asked, "Is your dog magic?" Loretta smiled. "No, baby. He just remembers." Then she went back to tending her flowers. Justice didn't return the years they lost, but it gave them back the right to walk freely, and that could never be taken again. That evening, sitting with her daughter on the porch, Loretta looked up at the dark sky and whispered, "Even walls have light. We're just slow to turn it on." Charlene didn't answer. She rested her head on her mother's shoulder and took a deep breath. In the distance, a bell chimed softly, and Juno perked up, alert. The world looked the same, but they both knew something had changed. Faith no longer carried the weight of waiting. Now it carried the fragrance of promise fulfilled. And life, though scarred, was blooming again. The town cemetery woke under a gentle fog, as if heaven itself wanted to hold silence just a little longer. Miss Loretta walked slowly, the Bible pressed to her chest, and a small white flower in hand. Charlene followed in silence, holding a ribbon with the child's name written by hand. It was their first return to this place since the funeral, not out of duty, but choice. The trees swayed softly in the morning breeze, and two sets of footsteps marked the damp ground. Juno walked beside them, his nose alert but calm, as if he knew exactly where they were going. There were no crowds, no cameras, just faith, scars, and a bond time could not break. They arrived at the child's grave. His name was partly covered by dry leaves, and Charlene gently brushed them aside. Her fingers touched the stone as if touching a moment lost forever. Miss Loretta knelt beside her daughter and laid the flower on the earth. "He was a victim too," she whispered, eyes full of tears. "Of a system, a lie, a pain no one wanted to see." Charlene closed her eyes. Here she was not the accused nanny. She was simply a woman who had loved a little boy as her own. Words didn't come easily, but silence, in that moment, said everything. Juno slowly approached and lay down at the foot of the grave. He rested his head on his paws and sighed, long and almost human. Miss Loretta watched him closely. "He knows," she said softly, like a prayer. Charlene looked at the dog with tenderness. He always did. There, between earth and absence, something beyond explanation existed. It wasn't just grief. It was mutual recognition of everything lost and everything restored. A child. A truth. A life returned to the one who should never have lost it. While the two women remained in silence, the sun quietly broke through the clouds. A beam of light touched the headstone, and the shadows receded just a little. Charlene took her mother's hand. "I dreamed of this so many times," she murmured. "And still, it doesn't feel real." Miss Loretta smiled gently. "Truth takes its time, baby. But when it comes, it doesn't need to shout. It just stays." A bird landed on a branch nearby, singing softly. It was as if all of creation breathed relief with them. That moment, simple, silent, was worth more than any court ruling. At the cemetery gate, a young reporter waited. She didn't press them. She simply asked in a soft voice, "What does it feel like to see your daughter free?" Miss Loretta drew a deep breath. She looked to the sky, then to Charlene. Her eyes welled up again, but her voice didn't tremble. "I feel like God still answers, even when the world tries to silence you." Then she looked at Juno rising slowly to his feet. "And sometimes he sends a dog, because he knows people won't listen." The reporter didn't reply. She simply lowered her camera, visibly moved. As they passed through the cemetery gate, Charlene looked back, for the first time without guilt. The weight of years still lingered, in her shoulders, her voice, her eyes. But the sentence was no longer hers. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was a survivor of a system that tried to bury her alive. Juno walked beside her with ease, as if he too had completed his journey. Miss Loretta led the way, just as she always had. But now, her steps were lighter, as one who carries a fulfilled promise. That evening, back in the humble house in their neighborhood, Loretta lit a candle and placed it in the window. For the boy. For us. For all the forgotten innocents. Charlene watched in silence, sitting on the couch with the red notebook open on her lap. "Mama, why did you never give up?" she asked. Miss Loretta smiled. "Because love doesn't stay quiet." Then she placed a hand over her heart and said, "And because I knew that, on the right day, the truth would bark." Outside, the wind blew gently, and the silence was no longer made of pain. It was peace. Juno lay on the porch, eyes closed as if guarding and releasing the final secret. The world would go on. The press would chase another story. But here, in this house where faith and scars had learned to live together, everything had changed. Justice was no longer a distant idea. It was alive, shaped by prayers, notebooks, embraces, and a nose that never forgot. When Charlene closed her eyes to sleep that night, there were no bars, no verdicts, no fear, only a whisper in her soul. You are alive, and you are free. Inside that prison, a single bark revealed what human eyes failed to see. Charlene was innocent, but her truth had been buried for years, silenced by louder and more powerful voices. How often do we judge without truly knowing? How many other Charlenes are out there waiting for just one attentive gaze, one willing ear? Today you've learned that it's not always what we say that reveals our essence. Sometimes it's what we don't say, what we hide, or what others try to hide from us. Because truth always finds a way to emerge, whether through a mother's quiet faith or the relentless instinct of an old dog. The world might try to silence justice, but justice always finds a way to speak loudly and clearly. Consider all the times you've accepted a version without questioning, accepted others' judgments as absolute truths. How many stories would be different if we stopped to listen to the other side? Miss Loretta taught us to never underestimate the power of persistence, hope, and love that refuses to quit. Her quiet journey showed that profound transformations don't require spotlights, just courage and unwavering faith. And Charlene, despite everything, never allowed bitterness to take hold in her heart. She chose dignity even on the darkest days. How many of us could keep hope alive in times of absolute darkness? How many could face injustice with such serenity and resilience? Maybe it's time to reflect on the silent strength we all carry within ourselves. Juno, with his simple and pure instincts, revealed something no one else could uncover. His nose proved stronger than documents, testimonies, or verdicts. This shows us that sometimes the answers we seek come from the least expected places, from something or someone we often ignore or underestimate. What if the key to the greatest revelations lies precisely in the small details we overlook our entire lives? Perhaps it's time we paid more attention to the silence around us, to the little things that seem insignificant, yet carry profound truths. Because ultimately, life's greatest lessons often come from things we cannot fully explain, but feel deeply in our hearts. Life shows us that when we look beyond appearances, we find surprising answers hidden in plain sight. Now, an important question remains. How do you view the world around you after everything you've seen here? Are you ready to look with greater empathy, question more carefully, and listen more closely? This story teaches us that appearances rarely tell the full truth, and that we must find the courage to challenge our own certainties. It also reminds us that true justice doesn't reside only in courtrooms, but in the hearts of those who refuse to accept the silence imposed by the majority. It teaches us that even in the face of great injustice, we must never stop fighting for what is right, Because what truly matters is not how quickly the truth emerges, but how strongly we hold on until it finally does. And when truth arrives, it transforms not only those directly involved, but everyone who witnesses it. If this story touched your heart, then there's something special inside you. Something that recognizes the value of justice, truth, and the courage to move forward. Join us on this journey to discover stories that deserve to be heard, real stories of people who, like Charlene and Loretta, never gave up. Because it's not enough to simply hear these stories, we must share them so others may also learn and find inspiration. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Together we can give a voice to those who must be heard and offer hope to those still waiting for justice. Because sometimes all someone needs is a person like you who's willing to listen with the heart. Justice begins when indifference ends, and that starts with each one of us.